Passion Harvest. Hello, passionate listeners. Welcome to Passion Harvest, where we aim to inspire you to live a passionate life. I am your host, Louisa, International Passion Ambassador, and I really thank you for making me a part of whatever you are doing right now. And if you like this episode, please do subscribe. My guest today is Diana Durham, who is a world-renowned author. And I can't wait to talk with her. Diana began a deep inquiry into the possibility that our global crises are reflections of a prevailing dysfunctional sense of identity and consciousness in us as human beings. These ideas were explored in her non-fiction book, The Return of King Arthur, completing the quest for wholeness, inner strength, and self-knowledge coming into focus in the figure of the wounded king and the Wasteland Kingdom that is a reflection of his wound found in the Grail myth. Diana realized that the way to heal the wasteland, the problems of our society, and the damage to our ecology is to heal consciousness. If wounded people produce a wasteland, whole people produce living systems. I just have to read that again. If wounded people produce a wasteland, whole people produce living systems. Diana is a graduate of University College of London with a BA in English literature and so many more things. She is also a certified practitioner of attunement, a lifestyle and healing practice. Diana is the author of 3 poetry collections, Sea of Glass, To the End of Night, and Between Two Worlds. And before I introduce Diana, I have to read her credo from her website. It is so beautiful and it really sums up everything about her, and what a beautiful introduction to the interview. She writes, I believe we have access to a source of insight unique to each one of us that can inspire and guide what we do. I believe that this source flows like a stream, continually clear and refreshed. Streams emerge from underground springs and rainwater that falls on the land around. Ultimately, they are fed by the whole interconnected system of Earth's water and weather. I believe our flow of insight arises similarly from a wide and deep weave of cultural and inner life, and constitutes a vital aspect of who we are. If we ignore our inner promptings, we grow confused. We give weight to the opinions and viewpoints of others and downgrade our own. At the same time, we overemphasize the impact that our upbringing and our surroundings have on us, while underestimating or overlooking our own power to shape our lives. Myths and archetypes from folklore and sacred writings, often called the wisdom traditions, encode this understanding. They also teach us that we are systematically connected to the world we live in, and explain it is important to stay attuned to the wise inner source, because the way we experience ourselves affects how we impact the world. That is why they are called wisdom traditions. My work as a writer is to share and explore these truths and their implications, for I also believe the leading edge of human experience lies now in mastering the forces of our own consciousness. Understanding ourselves and how we create frees up imagination and allows us to evolve ideas that play out into harmony with others and with the ecology of our beautiful planet home. That was amazing. Diana Durham, this is her story and this is her passion. Welcome to Passion Harvest.
Thank you.
I just love that. You're such a beautiful writer, and I'm so excited to have you on the show. Thank you for being at Passion Harvest. I always like to give a little bit of introduction about yourself for those people that don't know you. I know you've personally had some incredible experiences, and just give a bit of background about your life or some pivotal moments in your life that made you who you are today.
Well, I was brought up in a very ordinary background. It's lower middle class British. But I was always searching for something, but I didn't really know what it was. I couldn't understand why people's lives around me, the sort of the grown-ups, were so unhappy. Why, we weren't people who were poor. We didn't have really big problems in our lives, the people that are my parents and the people I knew, but no one was very happy. And when you're a child, you know what happiness is. And so you can sort of reflect, you reflect on the difference, but unconsciously, I think. And I found that as I got older, I found that I gravitated to writers, poets and novelists, because they seem to be the only ones that said anything really interesting and really important. Because I was a teenager or whatever, I'd be listening to the news and I just thought, well, none of this seems to really go to the heart of ourselves and of the world we're living in. It all just seems to be by rote. Again, I'm kind of putting a voice back into a younger consciousness. I didn't quite think those ways. And I also think at some point, I watched, I don't know how old I was, I maybe 12 or something, and I saw some of those documentaries coming out of World War II, showing the liberation of the death camps, the concentration camps, some of those images. And I just thought, well, what's going on in the world if human beings can do that to other human beings? There's something here we need to sort of think about. And the same with the bombs, the H-bomb, atom bombs. What's going on in us? How can this possibly be happening? So these were sort of threads of inquiry, I suppose. And that more or less stayed with me. And then when I was 18, I met up with a long lost cousin who happened to live in a community in Canada. And I thought at the time, oh, it's a hippie community. And I'd finished high school and I was looking for a little bit of an adventure. And so I went to stay there thinking, well, if I don't like the hippie community, which was up in the sort of wilder regions of British Columbia, I can always stay with my aunt and uncle who will be normal. There'll be normal people living in Vancouver, in the city, just like my parents. But when I landed there, I found that they lived there too, so that there were old people as well as young people, and that, piqued my curiosity.
Where was it, can I ask?
Yes, it was in British Columbia. It was, it's the sort of plateau region up in the mountains of British Columbia. And so I got on this train and I made my way up the most spectacular scenery after suburban Britain, rivers and mountains.
So beautiful.
And I thought, I felt so excited because I felt I was on a real adventure, because I knew I was going to something very different. I was a bit worried that it would be a weird community and they'd try and brainwash me, because I didn't like anything to do with the word spirit at the time. But in fact, the people were very nice and they were very kind to me, but they didn't make a big fuss. And if I wanted to join in, I could with the chores, with the work that they did. And if I didn't, that was fine too. And long story short, I had a remarkable time there. But also what happened to me was one evening I had an experience of transfiguration. And what I mean by that is I was sitting having tea with some friends. It was all very normal. And I suddenly felt this power rise up in me. And it was like, I can still sort of remember it, even though I can't quite feel what it felt like. But it was like a golden sun, and I became so powerful. And I remember, so this was happening, but a little part of me was looking at what was happening. And I remember thinking, oh my goodness, this is what that word love means. This is what love is. And this is what that word truth means. Because they're words we use a lot and we kind of know what they mean. But I thought, this is what they mean. And this is what we are. This is what we are. And then I thought, oh my goodness, what happens when I go back to London? I'm going to be so powerful. I'll take over the whole world. I'll take over London. What am I going to do? I don't know how to handle this. And I said, it sounds crazy, but I said something like that to the people in the room, who of course couldn't see anything different about me. And it didn't last very long, just probably a few seconds actually, a few minutes. And they just said, oh, don't worry, you'll be fine. They wanted to reassure me. And then it sort of, it faded, and I was just back in the room having tea. absolutely sort of gobsmacked, by this experience that came out of the blue. And then as I went on reflecting about it, I thought, oh my goodness, this is in every single person on the planet. And most of us don't know about it.
It's available to all of us.
It's available, it's there, it's who we actually are. So I touched into the kind of experience that, we read about, various mystics talk about this. There's all different ways of describing it. There's a wonderful poem by Yeats, actually. It's a chapter, one of the chapter headings in the King Arthur book, I quote it, where he talks about a very similar experience. He's just sitting in a cafe and suddenly he's just filled with this energy. He called it a blessing, the energy of blessing. And so I thought, well, if we knew about this, wouldn't this world be so different? And I got this kind of thought of going into history of how all the pain and suffering of human beings, and yet we're just inches away from this beautiful power, this energy and assurance and everything, and that's, when we leave our bodies, that we re-experience that in its full blast quality. But I suppose coming out of that, I suppose the question was, well, how does my, what I now call my personality self, the self that was born in lower middle class England and
Diana.
Diana, who's had a very specific upbringing and has a certain DNA inheritance that's quite specific to me, and probably not that unusual as well. Other people have variations on a theme, brown eyes, brown hair. But I also mean qualities of character. How do these two, and then has certain experiences and certain opinions and likes this kind of food and doesn't like something else, how do these two things, how do they go together? How do they work together? Because I think that as human beings, we have these two sides to us, and we get, we can't go off and live in that spiritual side, because we're supposed to be here in these bodies in space and time. But at the same time, if we're completely disconnected from that, and we feel that our identity, and it is all our beliefs, actually, these things, we believe that we are just this nature and nurture body, we can be very vulnerable to circumstances, and we can feel that we are victims rather than the very powerful people that we actually are.
I mean, when you talk about that, I've had a lot of guests talk about similar things. There's so many, they're just words, but I get the word veil. So many people have a veil, if you want to call it, over them in some capacity, but I guess it's the comparison between our ego and our soul, or our self and our multidimensional self. How do the two coincide, and how can we live like that on this earthly plane in our physical bodies?
There are all of these words, because we're talking about a realm, both our personality self and our inner self, however you want to, they're both realms that you can't really grasp entirely with the intellect. But we can think about them, we have thoughts about them, but the actual experience is something quite different. It's like if someone falls in love with another person, that's a very different experience than just sort of thinking about it or reading about it in novels. When you actually have the experience, it changes you. And so it's the same with these dimensions of self. But just as, we have two eyes that see slightly different, they focus slightly differently. We have two halves of the brain, the two brain hemispheres are now known to focus and slightly to pay attention to the world in different ways. So we think in stereo rather than mono,
Okay.
We see in stereo, we hear in stereo. So our whole being is made up of these two. The relationship between the two is what comprises our full identity. And because of our history of intellectual thought and for other reasons, we no longer believe we have a soul. You know, our modern society, the basic assumption underlying our modern day society is that there isn't a soul. We're biological machines, and we're run entirely by our genetic inheritance, or by the terrible things that happen to us. And there are terrible things that happen to people. I'm not wishing to discount that. There are terrible things that happen to kids. But ultimately, that's what we're given by our society.
We're defined by almost.
We're defined that. And so then we're conditioned that way as we grow up, and we believe that, and therefore to some degree we create that. And we disconnect, we as I say in that credo, we discount this whole other side, even though it's so powerful.
And you're also so in tune with nature and the environment. So people are so, obviously, I guess that sort of segues into coinciding with aligning with Mother Earth as well, and nature, which we seem to have detached ourselves from as well.
Yes, I think that's probably true. I mean, it's interesting because, yes, we've come to see nature just as a resource. We talk about sustainable living, and we must just sort of manage it so that there's enough left for us to keep going. You know,
some people aren't even interested in sustainability, but
right. So that's a materialistic view, and it used to be the Christian view used to be that the world was fallen, you know, and so it was in both cases the natural world was seen as detached from the divine, if you like, or the spirit, or the magic, or the but I don't think it is, and I think there's this very, very interesting relationship between our consciousness and the outer world that's just as important in a way as the relationship with this inner flow of ourselves. I think the two work together in very, very interesting ways, which are very intricate and quite difficult to articulate.
No, and you're explaining it very well. I guess it begs the question, how do we connect with both of those, I wouldn't say extremes, because they could be very intricately related. How do we connect with the self and the multidimensional self?
Well, I think that I think you just pay attention a lot of the time to how you feel. I think that idea that Abraham Hicks' idea that your emotions are a guidance system is a very helpful one. You know, it's quite a revolutionary idea to say, well, I'm feeling unhappy. Oh, well then, what is the thought you're holding? Well, I don't think I'm any good at anything. Well, that thought is so out of it's such
alignment. I think she talks about alignment.
Yeah, to the power that's inside you. They're so out of sync that you feel the discord. You know, that's an amazing insight. It's so simple.
I just love her, and I think her words. She says, "A belief is just a thought you keep thinking."
Exactly, and that's exactly what it is. And they're helpful beliefs, but I think they should always be open to malleability. You know, it's when they become fixed and when they become part of our own identity that we run into problems, really.
It is true, and I honestly believe, I mean, I'm just speaking personally from my own experience, that coming into alignment with the self and the multidimensional self, one of the best ways is to get happy. It's the easiest, most simplest way.
Yeah. But how do you get happy?
Practice.
Indeed.
Practice. It is practice, really.
It is.
The more you practice at it, the better you get, and things, you know, seem to not bother you so much anymore, and things don't worry you as much, and you do get happier.
Right. Yes, it's very true.
That's why it's called the law of attraction, I guess, because
so you practice different thoughts. You
I think she calls it pivoting.
Yeah, yes, that's right. So I mean, the Grail myth is all about this. It's about this coming to understand our own consciousness put into this extraordinary story form, symbolic form, that I think it's like our dream, our collective dream.
Well, I'd love to talk about that. And for those that haven't read, and I want to move on to your new book a little bit further down in the interview, but The Return of King Arthur and the Grail Myth, I'd love to hear about that. It's incredible for anyone that's listening, by the way.
Thank you. Well, no, I mean, those myths are amazing. And writing that book, I blew my mind. I mean, I suppose I didn't. The myth blew my mind. So as I delved in and saw all these little facets and what they meant, but essentially, the King Arthur story and the Grail story run in parallel together in all the different versions. If you go into them, and often you find the Grail story is in the background of the King Arthur thread, and vice versa. The King Arthur story is in the background of the Grail thread. And to me, I interpreted this as the King Arthur story, meaning our collective evolution as a society or as a world, whatever, a Western world, I don't know. It's a Western myth. And the Grail is the individual thread running through that, and how the two interact. And I had a mentor. I mean, I met someone who was my King Arthur, who inspired me to go on the quest to go and find my own authority. That's what happens in the myth. And the Grail story, I think I've come to focus on that more certainly in my more recent book. The Grail story, Percival begins by not knowing very much. He's quite sort of foolish, but he's very successful in a way. He overcomes various wayward knights, he trains, he gains skills, and he saves his sweetheart. He finds a sweetheart, and he saves her from other wicked knights who are besieging her. And then he stumbles into the castle of the wounded king. And that's the real center of the story. And he's sitting in a banqueting hall next to the wounded king, and a door opens at one side of the room, and the great light. Now, this room is already full of candlelight and firelight, but a beautiful young woman steps in. She's holding the golden chalice, and as she steps into the room, it's as if the sun has come out. So much light fills the room, and he's staring at this, and he's wondering, well, who does this Grail? Who's it for? What's it for? Whom does it serve? Who's going to drink out of it? And she walks from one side of the banqueting hall across in front of them and goes into another door on the other side and disappears. And previously, Percival has been advised not to talk too much.
Okay.
It shows that he's rather foolish. You see, one of his very kind advisors who trained him as a knight realized he was rather naive and foolish, and every time he opened his mouth, he sounded a bit silly. So he advised him not to talk too much. And as a result, he doesn't ask the question, whom does the Grail serve? He just stays silent. So he doesn't fully understand what's going on. And then later on, he gets scolded for not having asked that question by a grieving maiden and then a hag who comes and tells him that because he didn't ask about it, the wasteland is going to persist and the wounded king will stay wounded. And he doesn't understand any of this. But eventually he says, okay, I'm going to go and I'll find that castle again, I'll find the Grail. So what's going on in that room, the story has suddenly turned into a symbol of our consciousness. And the Grail represents the heart as it's filled, just like that experience of mine that I described earlier. that's what that's describing an epiphany, a very major epiphany. As the Grail, and it's almost as if the heart has turned its attention away from the outer world, and it's moved through consciousness and is reconnected with the inner, right? So instead of being all wrapped up in identity outside of ourselves, I'm just this kind of person, and I've got all these problems, and I've got these challenges. Suddenly it's bam, it's like me sitting in that little room having tea, and I'm filled with this golden power. It's like suddenly you touch into something, and you suddenly realize that there's something very different going on in the world, and that you have power. Power isn't just outside of you with people and institutions, right? People that have sway over you. It's in you, but you don't understand it yet. You don't consciously understand it. You've had the experience.
Percival doesn't,
but Percival is us.
Oh, is Percival you? I beg to ask the question, is he you? Or an aspect of you?
Yes, he's an aspect. It's like a dream where, every part of it is about you. Well, the myth is like that about us, about all of us. It's a language of our own psyche. So Percival has the experience. He doesn't know what it means, and he doesn't know where the Grail's gone to. And later on, he learns that it serves an elderly man with white hair who's very refined in nature. And of course, he's a symbol, this elderly man, whom I call the Grail King, who's living in that inner room, but we didn't see him. He represents God, let's say. Or you could say he represents the inner room of ourselves, where that power lies, that's there, but we don't always experience it consciously, which of course is another reason, another, we call that God sometimes, or we call it source energy, or we call it the soul, or, it doesn't really matter what we call it, but it's that inner powerful dimension, that golden energy. That's what the heart, the Grail is the heart. It's the container of the heart, and that's what the heart is supposed to serve. It's supposed to feel that energy and let that energy guide us in terms of, well, is this the right action, or is that the right action? Which is how we get to trusting our intuition and following our dreams. I don't know if
that was just beautiful. I just have to ask the question, did you know all this as you were writing it, or did you write it and then understand everything?
No, it was evolving. That's why it was so interesting. Obviously I had this touchstone experience, and I'd had lots of other experiences, and I realized that the Grail story was a myth about alignment, if you like, about spiritual connection. But I pulled out the meaning evolved over time. One of the keys was that symbol of the Vesica Pisces, do you know that symbol? Where the two circles overlap?
No.
Well, it's a very famous, it's an ancient symbol. It's just two equal circles.
Two half circles?
No, two equal circles.
Okay.
And the circumference of each intersects the other's center. And if you draw that geometrically, you get a kind of a shape, an almond shape in the middle, which is called the Vesica, and it means the vessel of the fish, because it makes a fish shape. You never heard of that symbol?
I potentially have, maybe if I see it visually.
Yeah.
Look, I'm a Pisces myself, so I probably have seen it.
Oh yeah. And sometimes it's called the almond, what's the word? I can't think of it now. There's an Italian word, but it means almond. It's just talking about the shape that is made geometrically when you create this shape of the two overlapping circles. Well, the fish reference got me in touch with the wounded king, because he's also the wounded fisher king. And we can talk a bit about that, why he's called the fisher king. The reason because he's wounded and nothing can heal him. Nothing makes him better. The only thing that relieves his pain is when he goes fishing. So it's called the fisher king, the wounded fisher king. So I put together that with this symbol, and that began to open up the meaning of the Grail legend to me. Because that symbol has been used by quite a well-known writer about Tibetan Buddhism to indicate, to symbolize the overlapping of inner and outer consciousness. So the inner self, the outer self, when they merge, they create this fish opening shape in the middle.
Yes, like the two circles.
And that becomes, yeah, and that's that balance. That's a symbol of balanced consciousness, where the inner and the outer are merging.
Mm-hmm. Like almost like the yin and the yang and the unity.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. So all of that's in there in that amazing myth. I mean, there's so much in there.
That's beautiful. And we've been talking about the soul and consciousness, but I also wanted to ask you about psychic DNA. You do talk about that. What is psychic DNA?
Well, psychic DNA, funnily enough, I recently asked a good friend of mine if he'd review my book. And then I remember that my new book, back along the way when I was writing the King Arthur book, he used the phrase himself, oh, those myths, the Grail myth, and it's psychic DNA. And I thought, oh, he's so right. So I have to attribute to William Duffield, my good friend.
Thanks, William.
Yes. And well, it just means that. It means that they are the shaping, just like DNA informs our genetic patterning in some ways that we don't fully understand. These myths inform our psychic patterning. I call them our operating instructions.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I think of them like when you go and buy a really, complicated gadget, like a new computer, or, I mean, my daughter recently, they just bought a pram and it was so complicated. They had this whole booklet explaining how it worked, how you opened it, and how you put it together. And I think it's like those booklets that we get along with our gadgets that explain how it works, but only they explain it linearly and with little diagrams. But the myths explain it in narrative and symbol, because we're very complex beings, and so we have a very complex and beautiful symbol and narrative to explain ourselves. It's not the only myth that does that, of course, but the Grail myth is peculiarly full and sophisticated in the way it talks about the magical way not just our consciousness, but our relationship to it and how we figure out how to use it. Because Percival, after that moment in the Grail, he goes off and tries to carry on being a knight and, doing things that knights are supposed to do and overcoming other knights and doing good deeds and all the rest of it. But he keeps being told by these, they're always female characters, you're wasting your time. You need to go and find out who the Grail serves. You didn't ask that question. Because if you don't ask that question, you won't heal the king. And if you don't heal the king, you won't restore the wasteland. Because that's the question that's going to heal the king. Now, why does it heal the king? Because the wound is the consciousness that's disconnected from the power within. That's what the wound symbolizes.
The disconnection with source that you mentioned before.
That's what that wound is all about. And
if you could put it into modern terms, it could be called a dis-ease or disease within the body, potentially.
Well, it can lead to that. I mean, all psychic problems can lead to that, but it's the fundamental wound, which is the losing of one's power, right? Because that's the real power. So he's unable to bring life to his land, you see, so the land reflects it. The cattle can't reproduce and the crops fail, and the land is ravaged by war and conflict.
A direct reflection. So I guess, sometimes we sort of brush away myths, wherever they might come from various societies or traditions or Indigenous people, but in fact, I guess they're fundamental to our psychic DNA.
I think so. Again, I think sometimes we have a dream that's very powerful and we remember it after we've woken up and we think about it. And it's dreams are symbolic, obviously, and they often have a strange narrative to them. And you start thinking, and you go backwards and forwards between your actual real life, awake life.
Well, what is real? I have to ask the question, because I'm of the belief now that dreams are potentially the reality.
Well, they're part of the reality.
Part of the reality.
Part of the reality. Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt you. Please continue.
No, so you think backwards and forwards. You must have had this experience, where you.
I had a very vivid dream last night, actually. Three very vivid dreams.
Well, sometimes there's something in there, and you think, oh, I know what that means. That means, I don't know, that conversation I had yesterday, or my mother, or whatever it is. And then that, once you know what it means in this realm, in the waking realm, then that throws more light back onto the dream. And as you understand more of the dream, you understand more of the waking world. And so this relationship between the dream and the real world opens up the meaning of both. And that's what the myth does. See, so when you read the myth, it might not make much sense, but then you start understanding what it means in terms of our lives and our psychic development and our consciousness. So that's really cool. I mean,
it's really cool how you explained it, and it's just amazing, and I just can't wait for people to read it. Honestly, it's a fabulous book, and you explain it so beautifully. Having said that, I'd love to talk about your new book. It is cool. Is it the Coherent Self, a Coherent World?
Coherent Self, Coherent World.
And also congratulations for all the books. I know, I mean, personally, from what goes into a book, I mean, you're a world-renowned author, but congratulations. Coherent Self, Coherent World, a new synthesis of myth, metaphysics and Bohm's implicate order. That's a tongue twister.
I know. And it's a very small book. It's a big title.
Is it? Okay, I'd love you to talk about it. I have to say I haven't read that one yet.
Do you know David Bohm?
No.
Heard of him?
No, I could lie, but actually I haven't.
No. Well, that book takes, it looks again, it really puts this symbol that I mentioned of the two circles of Vesica Piscis or Pisces, or the mandorla. That's the Italian name meaning almond. Some people know it as the mandorla. And some people call it a Venn diagram, because it's schools use it. I've seen it on the walls in schools where you're looking at you're looking at two areas, and you look at what overlaps between them, what's different, and what they share. And that's again like consciousness. There's the inner and the outer, and then they blend. And that shape, that basic shape, is where they blend. So it takes that symbol and really looks at it uses it to look at consciousness in very. I really wanted to show, because you can't cut consciousness away from the world. You see, so that the very way we are will affect the way we see the world, and therefore the way we act in the world. I mean, fundamentally, it's like if you feel unhappy, you will look out at the world, and you will see that as an unhappy world. And you will look at people, and you will relate to them in a way that is unhappy, because you will either dislike them, feel threatened by them, or you will feel dependent upon them for your sense of well-being. Right? So those are the fundamentals.
Yes, and it goes back to the premise that we create our reality.
Well, exactly. But how do we create it? Because we don't feel connected to our own power, right? As soon as you feel connected to your own power, you look back out in the world, and it's like the sun's come out, even if it's not a sunny day. You see it differently. You see people differently. You feel you're much more balanced. You don't feel threatened by people as much, nor do you feel demanding of them to make you feel okay, to make you, So you're free. Really, you're free. That's
what we're all looking for, really, isn't it? Freedom.
It's freedom.
Yes.
Absolutely. Power and freedom.
That's love that.
Yes.
Well, passion and freedom.
Passion. Well, absolutely. Well, this is passion. This isn't it. This is the essence of passion. Is alignment, really.
What a beautiful message you're sharing with the world.
Thank you. It is beautiful. It is beautiful. The myth is beautiful, and the way we're designed to work is beautiful. And when you know that experience, it's beautiful. And it's so sad to live, and not use this incredible power. The thing is, you're using it anyway. You just don't know. You don't realize. We get trapped in our own consciousness. It's very interesting.
I think it's something, we all have access to it. And as you said, one of my tips is get happy, but it does take practice, I think, many people say it takes 30 days to change a thought or a belief or a habit.
Yes, well, that may be true. I don't know.
And we live in an instantaneous, but we want everything instantly. It doesn't happen instantly.
No, it doesn't.
Unfortunately.
It doesn't. It's a person, indeed. But anyway, so I just want, so I'm drawing on those threads to explore how this works in finer, with a sort of a magnifying glass, really, over that particular part of the King Arthur book. I really wanted to look at the way consciousness and the world interact. And I also draw on, and so I draw on the Grail myth, I draw on some other archetypes to do that, draw on a bit of Tibetan Buddhist thought. But I also draw on David Bohm, who is a physicist, a theoretical physicist, who was as much a philosopher as he was a physicist. And he had new insight into the quantum reality, which I can't say that I fully understand it. But I know he was brilliant. He was a genius. And I met him because he was part of something called Dialogue, because he wanted to explore human thought. And I won't go into all of that, but he came up with a very interesting idea, which is that rather than seeing the universe as made up of lots of little tiny, essentially building blocks, even if they're tiny quarks or whatever they are, and so that the whole thing, in a sense, is material. And if you can find this thing, you'll be able to put it all together, and it's still a material universe. He kind of turned it on its head and said, no, the universe has a kind of an interior quality to it, which he called the implicate order. And the implicate order and the explicate order, which is the outer, are in a continual process of interrelationship. And meaning is expanded through this process. And I mean, just to give I give a very, very simple example in the book, is like, for instance, supposing the idea comes into my head to phone up my friend and we meet for coffee. So that's an idea, so that you could say that's the implicate, it's the unformed. But it leads to the explicate, because I pick up the phone and I talk to someone, and then we have coffee. So it's that meaning has emerged out of this idea and has affected the explicate world. I'm sitting there with my friend, suddenly, we get the idea we're going to meet regularly. So that's an idea, that's the implicate, but it's been created by sitting together, which is the explicate. So then if I'm, so that's just a very simple example of this process happening. But in the way that Bohm explored these ideas, he obviously went into much greater depth than we can do, or I can do justice to right now. Anyway, I do try to do it in my book. But it seemed to me that this was another amazing way, another language in which these worlds were in relationship, between the implicate and the explicate orders, and that meaning gets generated out of the interaction between the two.
Very interesting. I mean, I guess my other question to you is, do we live, is everything a mirror of our reality? Do we live in an isolated world? So if we do create our reality, we create the people that come into our reality as well? Or is it a collective consciousness that creates our reality?
I don't know.
Okay.
mean, I think there's something here already. Like when we're born, you know, I believe that we incarnate out of this other undimensional place, and we come into a body and grow up. And obviously we are starting to then form that world through our thoughts and intentions. But we've already come into something that's quite big and complex already here. I don't think that all just got made as soon as we were born, if you know what I mean.
It's a very interesting concept because, you know, we're influenced by our psychic DNA, as you call it, or our genetic DNA from our ancestors, and, you know, our thoughts and beliefs from our environment, from the family that we choose to come into this world with. So maybe it's a bit of both.
Yes, and those are like deep roots, aren't they? You could say they're deep roots in the empathy.
Cyclic roots, I guess.
Yeah.
Very interesting. Thank you so much for talking about this. I mean, I've loved our conversation. So, Diana, on a final note, I'd love to ask your advice for people. I guess this is two questions. How do they find their passion? And if so, what is your advice for them to follow their passions?
Well, I think there's a couple of things to say there. The word passion, sometimes it can mean, oh, well, I should be a great writer, or I should be a great politician. And it might mean that, like we come in with, it seems to be me that we do come in with certain sort of essences of intention to follow out. But I think increasingly these days, it might not just be one thing. It could be several things. And perhaps women know that better than men, because we can have children.
And multitask.
and multitask. And that there are lots of things with, you know, having children was one of the most meaningful things for me. So I don't think a passion necessarily means what it might have meant. Oh, I've got to be another Michelangelo. You know what I mean? But it might do. I think passion means whatever, you know, you feel interested in, whatever makes you feel, ooh. And it can mean something quite minor, like, I don't know, having waffles.
Flying a kite. I don't know.
Flying a kite.
Also, I had one guest said, whatever floats your boat. That's a good way of putting it.
And it might change. It might change during your life. It might be this and it might be that. But it's, you find it by listening to how you feel, into your intuition. That's the other thing, actually. I do write about intuition in Coherent Self, because we have these insights and we kind of get this sense that they're real, that you know, they're true, even before we know why they're true. And that's the reason we know that, is because the inner and the outer line up in a kind of new agreement. We get a new insight, we get a new compulsion. You know, and it's like that agreement between the two, saying, yes, the circles have lined up, the things opened, that's it, go for it. And so I think and if we've downplayed that in ourselves because of our conditioning, oh no, you know, it used to be that kids were conditioned by their parents, they were doctors, you've got to be a doctor. You know, it doesn't happen as much anymore, but if we're conditioned to think we should be doing something else, and we should be doing, you know, something else, we can lose the way that works within us. But it's foolproof. So you're listening for that intuition, for when that thing lights up in your mind, in your heart, and you feel it brings you alive and you feel excited by it. You don't know how to get to it yet. Don't worry about it, because the path will open. The path will open. Just like it is for you, right? I mean, beautiful answer. I mean, I always say and believe, if you follow your passions, the universe will support you. And beautifully said, because it's all about emotions. Well, that is your guidance system, really. It's the easiest guidance system if you find it without practice, hard to hear, guides, intuition, all those sort of things. The emotions are the easiest guidance system. And then you get the next step. Oh, I see, I could do this. I could do this.
And doors open and things happen and you meet people, and connectiveness and synchronicities. Right. Synchronicities, that's a good one.
All of that, yeah.
Yeah. Well, wonderful. Diana, it's been an honor and a pleasure to have you on Passion Harvest. And I can't wait to read your new book.
Well, thank you. It's been a lovely conversation. Enjoyed meeting you very much.
Thank you so much. And we'll speak soon.
All right.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
If you like this episode, please do subscribe for weekly passionate inspirational interviews.